Okay, we're going to be taking a look at the 1958 Avalon Hill version of Gettysburg. Now, a lot of you might think, well, I've seen that game around. That lasted well into the 60s, early 70s. Well, not really, because this game was replaced in 1964 with a box that looked very similar. Let's take a look at the two boxes. Now, there are several ways you can tell whether you've got a 58 edition or a 64. For one, the 58 edition counters are quite different. But just cosmetically, you can see the differences. One, the Gettysburg logo is in white with a light gray background, while the 64 version is in blue with a dark gray background. The other most obvious way is to look at the trademark on the cover of the box. The 58 version clearly shows 1958, and the 64 version does the same. Now, the nice thing about the version I have is it's actually an unpunched copy. And no, this isn't my copy from 1958. I was only 7 back then, so I was years away from even getting into war games. And the 64 edition, I don't have the exact year that they stopped making it. Probably it made it into the 70s, because I got into gaming in the 60s, 69 to be precise, and I bought the game back then. I know certainly by 1977 the game was gone because Avalon Hill had replaced it with the 77 edition. But we're going to look at the 58 edition to show you how radically different it was from other games at the time. Okay, well, one thing you got with the 58 edition was a mounted map. Now this one looks very faded compared to my 64 version. But it was mounted, and the 1958 copyright logo was down here in the bottom right. I recognize the map, actually. I once saw it years later in a game called They Met at Gettysburg, and it's certainly, well, it's not a great map, is it? I always thought these things looked like long shoes. Cemetery Ridge is highly exaggerated, and perhaps McPherson's Ridge is too. I don't think it would pass muster with Rick Barber, who was our current dean of really good Civil War maps, at least of Gettysburg. Anyway, we've got the features we all know if you know the battle. Big round top, little round top, Cemetery Ridge, the town itself, and the roads arcing to the north and northeast. So it was a functional map, and very light. You can't see it too well in the video. Maybe you can. There is a light grid on it with grid coordinates to the left and coordinates at the top. Now, the interesting thing about the 1958 version was that it included a tournament game inside the rulebook. A tournament game, you say, for 1958? Yep, a tournament game. Let's take a look. Now, cosmetically, the booklet in 58 looked a lot like the booklet in 64. It was a little bit cruder. It showed the counters, which were, frankly, pretty ugly. They were just ugly. That's all there was to it. I'll show you a picture of those in a second. You got these outpost counters, which the 64 edition did not have. And, of course, you got the corps and army leaders, which performed no game function. Notice the little illustration here of the counter. It shows the counter in the middle with the zones of control around it. Notice also that the counter does not fit into the square. That's because the original counters were larger than the square. Let me show you that. Like I said, my edition is unpunched, and I just didn't have the heart to punch it since I hadn't really intended to play it. So what I did was I made a bunch of counters the exact same size. You pretty well have to make them the same size. Now that I see it now, mine are a millimeter or two larger. But you can see they're not very pretty. They show an arrow, the strength, and I being for infantry, C for cavalry. They didn't even use the NATO symbols, so they were not very pretty. Let's take a closer look. As you can see, the counters are pretty plain. But if I'd been a young teenager in 1958 and was interested in history, I would have been tickled pink to own this game. The information is there, the arrow showing the facing that the division is in. Notice the corps is there and the actual name of the division. 4 being the size, combat factor of the unit, and I being infantry. C is cavalry. The cavalry were technically brigades, a little bit smaller counter, and the divisions were larger. Artillery was also shown, but they didn't have any fancy NATO symbols at all. You can see Imboden, Robertson cavalry. Where's the artillery now? There we go. There's the artillery. Dance, Nelson, McIntosh. You kind of miss those NATO symbols when they're not there. You got these little outpost counters. I'll get to them in a minute. There's some Union troops. Now I didn't want to punch out my copy, so I made some new counters, spiffing them up a little bit. So I tried to follow the 1964 model. So when I do the video and show you some of the moves, we'll be using the counters that I made. Cosmetically a little bit nicer looking, but that's neither here nor there. I just didn't feel like punching them. And that's the combat results table. It's what we later call the classic Avalon Hill combat results table with its 1-to-1 and 2-to-1 results, and it's attacker eliminated and defender eliminated. A lot of eliminations in this game. Although I see there's no de-eliminated in the 1-to-1. Got a defender back 1 here, so it's a little bit less bloody, and certainly cosmetically not a very nice looking table too. Back is just nothing and very plain looking. Now you also got these little rearrange cards, and a lot of you might be saying, what the devil were those used for? Well, you were supposed to cut them here, so you actually had 2, one for the Union, one for the Confederate. Again, I didn't want to hurt the original, so I made my own little range cards, and I'll get to that when I describe the tournament game, which is really the whole point of my video. You got these little illustrations cards, which are pretty cute. They're pretty basic. You know, they give you an advantage to show you that when you're on a hilltop, brackets entrenched, and triples require 6 complete turns to build them. Factor in place to achieve this level of efficiency. Hilltop, hastily entrenched, doubles the factor on arrival. I find the terminology and illustrations pretty interesting. But again, this is 1958. This is long before computers, the personal computer was invented. And I'm very forgiving for these old things. The order of appearance card is very, very basic. But again, considering the time it was made. Here's another interesting thing. This is just wild. The game begins on June 30th, the day before the battle, at 11 o'clock at night, I think it is, or is it 10, 11, 11? I have to look that up. Anyway, the game proper begins at 7 o'clock in the morning on the Gettysburg Road, and any of you who remember the 64 version, the units just crawled onto the board, because in those days, or in that version, you only moved 2. So you went on the board and went 1, 2, you know. Okay, that's 1 whole turn. That's an hour. And you went 1, 2. There goes another hour. So movement in this game was ridiculously slow. These are division units, so again, you'd do another turn, 1 hour, another turn, 1 hour, 1 hour. It took you nearly half a day to just march to Gettysburg, so there was a lot of gross things that were wrong with the game. Now, I just looked at the turn record card here, which was just a little pad of paper which you ticked off. And I was right, the game does start at June 30th at 10 o'clock at night. Then there's an 11 o'clock turn, and then there's a midnight turn, which is just wild because, wow, I mean, moving 2 hexes a turn, I mean, that's like 1 mile an hour. So the distance and spatial time relationship of this game was all off. It made no sense at all. But let's take a look at the tournament game, and what was it about that was so different? Before I show how the tournament game works, I should show you one of the big problems that the 64 version had with the grid already on it. Because it was a historical map with the grid thrown on, you had constant, I hate to say arguments, over where the men really were, and were they on a hill or not. For example, okay, you've got Barnes' division there sitting on the square. He clearly doesn't, he overflows the square, but it's clear he's on open terrain, no problem there. And if you got a fellow here, take Barnes again and put him on Cemetery Ridge, no problem. There's no question he is on Cemetery Ridge and is in fact doubled. But what do you do with a little square like that? I mean, the grid goes directly in the middle of the hill. So if Barnes is there, is he on a hill or not? I don't know. Half of him is, half of him isn't. And same for there, same for there, same for there. Now if you take the liberal interpretation that that's a hill, and that's a hill, and that's a hill, and that's a hill, then you're not simulating this gap at all of Seminary Ridge, because Seminary Ridge is certainly a hill. So if he's on Seminary Ridge on a hill, and you're here on a hill, you're both on hills, a lot of stuff just didn't make sense, because you couldn't simulate this valley here. There are also cases too where it was in doubt whether you're on a hill at all. I'll try to think of one here. Yeah, here's a little wee hillock between Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. I think that's known as Stephen's Knoll today. But if this fellow's here, we'll say Barlow's there, he's clearly in this valley between Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. But a rules lawyer could argue, well, wait a minute, there's a bit of a hill there, I should be on it. Well, oh, okay, fine. So you got into these constant arguments over as to what constituted a hill and what did not. And that's because, as I found out later, the grid was added on after the game was designed. The game was never designed to be played with the men using this grid. The grid was supposed to be used for the optional hidden movement rules. Let me show you then how the tournament game was supposed to work. Okay, the manual was about 20 pages long, but you got to the tournament game on page 12, Tournament Game of Gettysburg. This would be considered pretty advanced for 1958. And here's the key thing, right here. Let's see if I can zoom in on this. Units are moved by measurement of distance, not squares. Infantry, headquarters, and outposts may move 2 inches on the board on each turn. Cavalry and artillery units may move 4 inches a turn. So you're not using the grid at all for movement. And that had a lot of advantages rather than disadvantages. I'll try to show you what those were. Now I noticed that the range cards that came with the game are not 2 inches long. They are in fact 3 inches long. So you really did have to have a ruler to play this game. But let me show you how the cores came on the board in the original inception of the game. The rules say that you take the core, in this case we'll use the first core as an example, and you literally put it on the road. Remember, we are totally ignoring the grid. We're not even looking at that. You put the 3 units on the board, following the road exactly. Again, you don't have to follow the grid. And then you move them the 2 inches up the road. So you took your ruler and measured out 2 inches. And then you put the head unit there. And then everybody followed behind. Now that's how simple road movement worked. And it worked very well. Now, how did standard movement work? Well, it was the same thing, except you measured from the center of the counter out 2 inches in any direction you wanted. Let me give you an example. Now let's use the example of that awkward little hillock that we observed on the Emmitsburg Road. In the original game, you wouldn't really know whether that's on a hill or not. But using the original system, which was 2 inches, you took your little ruler, put 2 inches, guided it towards the hill, and there you could see you can move exactly on the hill, exactly 2 inches. Now there's no question at all that that man is on the hill. So as I was growing up and learning war games, I was kind of always cursing this game for all of the awkwardness in the grid. And it was only by studying the 1958 version that I saw that I was being run unfair to the game, because the original design never took that into account. I think Avalon Hill altered the game in a way that made it maybe easier to play, but introduced a lot of new problems to the game instead. Okay, now why did I decide to come back to this out-of-date, old-fashioned system that just almost doesn't make any sense? It's so out of date. But it does make a lot of sense. But the reason why I did go back to it was after playing Bonaparte at Marengo the other day. You can see my video on that, where the designer used polygons to move the units and face them. And as I said in the video, it's an ingenious system. It's a great system. It's a lot of fun, but I don't think it's the panacea or the right methodology for necessarily showing you historical battles. So I began thinking about this system, because more recently, I think a company's called, I forgot the name of the company, Beer and Pretzel Games or something. A new company has come out with period maps on very nice material, and they're using a gridless system too. The disadvantage of that system right now is the games are very expensive. They come in a tube. I think they're well over $100, $125 US, and I haven't bought one yet. But they are using a completely gridless system and going back to moving with, they're using a little wee chain instead of a ruler. But you can see where they're heading. They're really borrowing from the miniatures world, and that's all this thing really is. But when I think of all the advantages of this system, where you move by distance to where you want. So I place the troops where I want them, exactly where I want them, not where the grid has made me place them. So I'm not advocating we all go back to the 1958 movement system. I'm just saying that there were advantages to it that are being a bit lost today. At least with this system, you could get lines that at least bear a resemblance to the actual Battle of Gettysburg. Here you have what I've got, Meade's famous fishhook line, and you might extend it on here to Stephen's Knoll, and if you wanted to, you could put a division here on Culp's Hill, showing you that awkward fishhook. I didn't mention combat. I should mention that before I close the video. These range cards that I was talking about. How is combat performed then? Well, it's kind of neat. You put the range card in front of the unit, and that is literally its range, or what you might call zone of control. So let's say we've got Early's division here, and it decides to move 2 inches forward. So it goes here, and the center of the counter is there. So once he's moved, you take your little range card here and put it in front, and if any part of the counter was inside that range, you'd be having combat. Now I can see that even here it gets pretty iffy, but if you actually lay the counter down, you can see that the counter does engage Wadsworth. So in this case, you'd have Early, 04, engaging Wadsworth, which is a 6. Now let's just say, for the sake of argument, I roll a die here. So 4 to 6 is a 1 to 2. I roll the die, and I get a 5, which is 1 back 2. So I have to find out what that means. Yeah, now it's funny that the combat results table is still assuming you're playing the grid version. So he says it goes back 2 inches. But I think each of these squares is 1 inch, yeah. So you'd go back literally 2 inches. In other words, back to where he came from. So that's kind of how the combat worked. And very miniatures-like, but, you know, there was a bit of a charm to it. Again, keep in mind the date of this game, 1958. And it was really designed by the father of our wargaming hobby, Charles S. Roberts. Okay, I was trying to remember the name of that company that was doing these battles, and it's Command Post Games. I've just looked up here, commandpostgames.com, and their series of games is called Pub Battles, and they seem to have several titles in the series. There's a Waterloo one, there's a Brandywine one, and you can see they're using the little wee blocks again, and the gridless map. I don't know if I can expand on that. And there's Waterloo. I mean, they look really cool. So, but right now they're very expensive, I've noticed. See if we can zoom in on this. See if we can get a bigger picture. I guess not. Anyway, pubbattles.com. Now, I'm not advocating that we go back in time to 1958 and every single battle game designed from now on has to be using this gridless system. I just thought it'd be fun to look at an old classic and just pay a bit of respect to the past. So there it is, the 1958 edition of Gettysburg. Really almost like the founding game of our hobby. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching.